Thank you, that was great, Nathaniel. So I'll kind of try to pick up some of the threads and then go more specifically into Vajrayana. So Vajrayana is a technical term. It's actually a part of Mahayana, as Nathaniel was telling us about. But the common word that you usually hear is Tibetan Buddhism, but which isn't quite accurate because in the old days, Vajrayana also went down into Indonesia. It went across into China, into Japan, became known as Shingon. It went into Bhutan, Nepal, Sikkim, and other places. So it's not really actually Tibetan Buddhism, it's Vajrayana. So as Nathaniel was saying, and all of Buddhism is a living tradition. So same for Vajrayana, our teachers, their teachers, there's an unbroken lineage back to the time of Buddha. One thing that was very fortunate in Buddhism was that the Buddha taught, he and Jesus attained awakening, I mean that's how we would talk about it in Buddhist terms, about the same age, around about 30 years old, but Jesus only had 3 years to teach and Buddha lived till he was 84. So there was a great deal of time which has really helped preserve the enormity of his teachings that have been passed down. So all the Buddhist traditions draw from these same teachings, and then through the centuries, masters who practice these teachings and really delve deeply into them to understand them through their own practice, meditation practice and spiritual practice, realization experiences, wrote further texts, further commentaries, and gave further instructions for meditation. One thing that within Buddhism is a little bit different than we find in Christianity, that there isn't really that big of doctrinal differences. There's different emphases between the different lineages and traditions, but we're all based on Theravada. We all go back to those teachings as the root and the source from the Buddha. So, there are, of course, some theological differences, but it's not like that so much. Within Vajrayana, within Tibetan Buddhism, which came from India, it actually, Buddhist Tantra and Indian and Hindu Tantra rose simultaneously in India. Buddhist Tantra, which is another word for Vajrayana, arose out of the Mahayana great yogis and yoginis and a lot of deep realization as early as 2nd century CE with Nagarjuna, the great Madhyamaka, the great Mahayana philosopher, also was into some Vajrayana practice. And it arose gradually. And the tantric movement in general was a movement against seeing certain things as pure and certain things as impure or good and bad in terms of particularly labeling people or things or lineages as good and bad. And rather, the Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra also sought to help people realize the innate goodness and the innate purity of everything that is, of each and every human being, the essential equality of each and every human being. It was in some ways within Hinduism a reaction to the Brahmanism and the caste system. So Tantra sort of turned things out of the kind of hierarchies that tend to grow up in societies. Of course, later, as it became much more established, it had some of its own hierarchies, but in the early days of its movement, really was trying to show a different way beyond that. As was Buddha during his time, whether people were untouchables or kings or Brahmins or whatever caste they belonged to, he welcomed them all equally and took them all in equally. So one of the qualities that I've noticed very strongly with the Tibetan masters and my teachers is the honoring of all religious traditions. And this was very much from my own childhood. So how did a good Episcopalian Marin County girl get to be a weird thing like a Tibetan Lama? It wasn't something I planned at all. I was very devout as a child, grew up in Marin and Episcopalian, actually a fantastic spiritual upbringing. It's very deeply rooted in my heart, still it always will be. And yet, then I found that when I was about 13, I really wanted to go much deeper, and I was thinking, well, when do we get to the part where we go to the desert, like Jesus did? But that part wasn't forthcoming in, the early 60s in Marin, except our bishop did go off to the Sinai, but those were the wild days. Even in the Episcopalian Church, in the Diocese of San Francisco, California. So I started studying comparative religion, which really ended up, was primarily also what I did academically in college, comparative mysticism. But I started also finding true teachers and really studying in a number of paths in Zen and Sufism and mystical Christianity and yoga. I have a really deep love for religious traditions, and to me, the variety of religious traditions, both within Buddhism and within the whole world, is like a garden of flowers. So that, you might just want to have a garden with tulips, but, that might get a little boring. So I think all these traditions, from a Vajrayana point of view, all spiritual traditions arose out of awakened mind, out of people's, deep understanding of reality and what is really the truth. And arose out of that in different forms, in different flavors, in different ways, in different places and times in history. But there's a deep honoring of all religious traditions from a Vajrayana point of view. My own teacher that I originally met in San Francisco was one of the very old, great Tibetan masters. So I was very fortunate to study with him, Kala Rinpoche, who was one of the very early ones that was sent to the West by His Holiness Dalai Lama and Karmapa. This is actually an example of two lineages. There's 4 primary lineages in Vajrayana. And Dalai Lama, of course, is very well known, and he belongs to one of them. And my primary lineage is Kagyu Shampa, which also has somebody who's the head of it named Karmapa. And the lineages often work together. They often take teachings from one another. They practice together at different times. And that sending of Kala Rinpoche to the West was an example of the cooperation between Karmapa and Dalai Lama. He first came in 1972. His very first act upon coming to the West was to go to see the Pope, because he had understood that the Pope was sort of the main Christian guy in the West, so he thought he better go pay homage. This is a kind of a very Vajrayana approach, respecting all traditions. In general, the primary emphasis in Vajrayana is twofold. The development of wisdom, by which is meant really understanding the nature of reality, what is truly real, what is the unchangeable truth. So we all know that phenomena, changes constantly, but what is the unchangeable truth that we can always take refuge in, that is at the core of who we really are? So the core, and this is throughout Buddhism, but the core of the truth of reality and the truth of who we are as individuals is not something separate. It's a non-dual truth. So coming into discovering that is the essence of the path. And the other, which are said in Vajrayana to be like the wings, of 2 wings of a bird. One is the wisdom. The other wing is compassion and love. So the development of compassion and love, which both wisdom and compassion and love are seen as the innate nature of who we really are. So it's not so much that we have to become something we aren't, or like in the old days of the Puritans, you beat the kids so that, they're not going to turn out to be a little hellion or something. But that it's more a question of removing the confusion, the obscuration layers, negative habitual patterns, misunderstandings. All of that gets removed primarily through meditation practice, through prayer, through different kinds of spiritual practice, and also through the intersection of study and study of scripture, study of commentaries, study of the philosophy, and integrating that with one's meditation practice. So the compassion and wisdom, these two wings of the one bird. So the scholarly tradition is extremely strong in Vajrayana. All of the great old masters of the 20th century, as I said, I was very fortunate to study with many of them. All of them were great scholars, as well as many of them had, almost all of them had spent 10 to 25, 30 years in retreat meditating. And so the two of those coming together is the actualization of the realization and the coming into full flowering of the human potential. Then one goes out to serve others. So there's always this movement of the inward to really gain deep realization of reality and the development of all of our qualities out of the core seed that's in us, the innate goodness, wisdom, compassion, love, etc. that's in us, development of those, and then the coming out into society to work with people. And like Nathaniel was saying, the whole point of meditation practice is not for itself. It's so that moment to moment we can be aware and awake and in a present state of being and in a compassionate state of being with our own selves and with everyone. And those are not seen as separate, really, ourselves and others from a Buddhist point of view. Of course, we're individuals, but we're inseparable also, as Nathaniel gave us the good example from the piece of paper. So, thank you very much.